Welcome back to the channel. You are listening to Sheroy's voice, and this is the One Mic Podcast, Episode 2. I can't begin Episode 2 without thanking you all for the reaction to Episode 1. It was truly so heartwarming, so humbling. And I'm not talking about the usual sort of YouTube metrics of how many likes or how many views or how many subs, any of that. Even though that's all wonderful, by the way. I'm not saying don't do that. Please do. It was the nature of the comments that I received and the places that some of these comments were coming from. There were people from Texas, people from LA, someone from Paris, even someone from South Africa. One comment that really stuck out to me was, I'm so sorry I don't have your handle, but it was someone from Botswana. And he said something along the lines of, we're all here supporting you because family supports family. And the notion that someone I've never met who's on the other side of the world would say something like that, it just reminded me that amongst all of the darkness that we see and hear about and some people experience every day, there is a lot of kindness in this world. So thank you so much. It was so overwhelming. But enough of me being soppy. You didn't come here for that. You came here to talk football. So let's do that. Let's get into it. Arsenal opened the Premier League season with a 2-0 win over Wolves on Thierry Henry's birthday, no less. Can you ask for anything more on a sunny Saturday afternoon at the Emirates? But when you're looking at the opening fixture of a Premier League season, I completely understand that you don't want to go overboard either way with either analysing the positives or analysing the negatives because it's only one game. And I certainly felt that way with certain Man United fans after they won on the Friday night, particularly with overanalyzing the positives. But I'll leave it at that because this isn't a Man United podcast. So what do you look for on the opening day? I mean, I look for patterns of play. I look for a win. I look for ideally more than one goal. I look for ideally a clean sheet. I look for a team that ideally comes out unscathed in terms of injuries. And we did all of that. So in all, it was a success. There were positives and there were negatives. And anyone that knows me knows that I'm not someone that sort of polarizes. I'm certainly not someone that only delves into positives and only delves into negatives. So I'm going to deal with both here. But as I say, not anything to be read into too much because of how early in the season it is. One thing I thought was very telling. Prior to that match, Arteta did an interview for Sky Sports. I don't know if anyone caught it. It was actually a very good, very telling interview. He's someone that often keeps his cards quite close to his chest, but he was relatively open in that interview. And they asked, what's your vision for this team? Where do you really want this team to go? He could have said anything. He could have given a team that gets 114 points, sort of blasé, an answer, but not a real answer that he gave when the team were out in the States. But he said, I want this team to get to a level where, because inevitably we're not always going to be 10 out of 10. I want us to get to a level where even when our level by our standards is relatively low, we still manage to win Premier League games and beat the vast majority of Premier League opponents. That, for me, is what Arsenal versus Wolves was. I don't think we were at our imperious best by any means. Not saying that the Wolves were at their best either. It was the first game of the season for them too. But there were certain players that made certain uncharacteristic errors that absolutely would not be happening in game week 6, or you'd hope that they wouldn't be happening in game week 6, 7, or 8. But we still managed to get over the line. And to be honest, when it's not a game that anyone's really going to look back at and say, "Ooh, Arsenal got away with one there." So all in all, opening day, it was a success. But I'm going to start, let me start with the negatives because it's always good to finish on the positives. After the match, Arteta, whether it was the short bite-sized interview that he gives to the TV broadcasters or whether it was the sit-down press conference, he said something that I heard quite a few times last season. I heard what he said after West Ham at home. I heard what he said after Aston Villa at home. I heard what he said after Aston Villa away. And there were probably more times than that. Mikel Arteta said it was a first half where we should have scored 3 or 4 and killed the game off, but we didn't. He's right. But the notion that something that did plague us last season and perhaps contributed to our own undoing is still something that hasn't necessarily been addressed with personnel, new personnel this season, is something that's always in the back of everyone's mind. And I simply think that when you're looking at the front line that we have, notwithstanding the fact that a handful of them were very good, and I am going to come on to that, I do think that there must be at least one player out there, Victor Gyökeres, I'm sorry, I do think there must be at least one player out there that could improve that ratio, so that if you do have all of those chances, you probably do score 2, 3, or 4 times in the first half as opposed to 1. But we don't have that external personnel right now, so let's look at the players that we do have. You could not listen to an Arsenal podcast last year without hearing the name Kai Havertz. And you're not going to listen to this podcast without hearing the name Kai Havertz. He was good. Kai Havertz was good, although it was a bit of a mixed bag. If I'm looking at the first half, Kai Havertz for me in the first half was the player of the half. It was the man of the match. I mean, he was the man of the half, and certainly in with a shout of man of the match. Not just because of the goal, but the way in which he was so involved with play, almost backed himself and showed a level of confidence that I absolutely don't think he would have been able to show at the start of last season when it came to certain attempts, albeit unsuccessful attempts at beating his man. And that bodes well. That bodes well because there's definitely visible, tangible confidence with this guy now. And of course, I mean, he also gets the assist for the second goal. I know a lot of people are talking about Saka, goal and assist. What an efficient machine. I will get on to him. But Kai Havertz did the same. So Kai Havertz certainly deserves his flowers in that respect. But if I'm being ruthless, and the only reason I'm being this ruthless is because the standards of the Premier League and the people that we are competing with demand that we are this ruthless, he could have done more. There was something, I mean, the game actually, as a microcosm, perhaps summed up Kai Havertz as a 9 or as a striker, whatever you want to call him. He gets the goal, but there's a moment in the second half where some brilliant work is done down the left wing. Kai Havertz does everything right. He's in a position that no one else is in. It's a late run. He's got loads of space. A wonderful touch to kill the ball. Absolutely fluffs this finish. I mean, on the AFTV watch along yesterday, we were talking about how it was a FIFA finesse shot, but the finger slipped off the button when it was bad. It was bad. And you can't help but think that someone who is more well-versed in the art of putting the ball in the back of the net and someone that has made their living of playing in that position or come up through the ranks playing that position would do better. That being said, all in all, a more than good start for Kai Havertz in the season, but there were certain things that, if they persist, there will continue to be talking points. And they, unfortunately, if they persist and the season doesn't pan out the way that we want it to, because of the fact that something like that has persisted, regrettably, these conversations are going to be slightly more unforgiving, I do fear. But fortunately, I wouldn't say we got away with it, but fortunately we had a couple of players that Arteta loves talking about the game state, so I'm going to do it as well. We had a couple of players and a couple of moments that altered the game state for us. 1-0 to Arsenal, and there's a ball over the top. Gabriel and Saliba caught napping a little bit. David Raya in that situation alters the game state. Because if that becomes 1-1 going into half-time, I can assure you that the Emirates would have been even more nervy than it was around the hour mark when Wolves were in the ascendancy. And I've heard so many pods already discussing the fact that that's a save that David Raya ought to be making. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that you might think that it's a save he ought to be making, that doesn't detract from the fact that it was an impeccable save. There was magnificent connection made with that header. It was guided into the side of the goal that David Raya was moving away from. He had to get his feet in order and get a strong hand to it, but that isn't the end of it. He showed the awareness, park the fact that Gabriel was there to cover him, because in that moment, I don't think he could even that couldn't have occurred to him. He knows where the ball lands and he jumps on it, and that's the end of that. That could have altered the game, and maybe it's because I've been scarred by some of these moments now, having been in recent title challenges as a fan. Sometimes I worry that I'm speaking about this as a player when I'm absolutely not one. But you can't help but look back at some of these moments and think, could that be a pivotal moment come the end of the season? I mean, I know it might sound like we're placing far too much emphasis on small things and small margins, but ultimately it was those small things and small margins that cost us towards the end of last season. Well, didn't cost us towards the end of last season because we were incredible. Cost us throughout the course of last season and ended with us not winning the Premier League. So David Raya, flowers to you. I don't know if you haven't caught the last episode on James's channel, the Gooniverse podcast, myself, James, and Nick Francis, I can't take credit for the point. Nick brought up that David Raya was going to be integral from a distribution point of view. James quite rightly says that he wants there to be games where you can look back at that and say David Raya has saved us some points, because although there were a handful last year, there weren't many. Well, he's 1-for-1 right now for me. He's 1-for-1 because that could have ended up in drop points. God knows, right? Why leave it to hypotheticals? The goalkeeper stood up there, and credit to him. In the same way that very often people come down hard on players when they don't do what they're meant to do, give them their flowers when they go above and beyond and do something that is exceptional, because that's exactly what Raya did there. But I can't talk about changing the game state without talking about Bukayo Saka. I was mid-sentence on the AFTV watch-along, and I was saying something along the lines of, I haven't been talking about the football for the last 10 minutes because I've been trying to take my mind off it because I'm quite concerned that Wolves are about to bang. Bukayo Saka scores and changes the game. A brilliant bit of quick thinking, to take the free kick quickly. Absolutely. And it means the Wolves can't quite get back into position quick enough, but by the time Bukayo Saka gets the ball and cuts inside, there are a few players around him. No less. Aït-Nouri in front of him. Their best defender, in my opinion. I was thinking that Bukayo Saka, and I think that the goalkeeper and the defender were probably thinking that Bukayo Saka was going to go into the far corner. Why? Because that's what Bukayo Saka does, right? That Bukayo Saka is sort of like Iron Robin. He cuts in and he does what he's going to do, and even though you know what he's going to do, and even though you might think it's predictable, you can't stop it. No, that's not what he does. Goes to the other corner like a bullet. And notwithstanding the fact that that is actually the side that Jose Sá should have been able to get to, I think the power of the strike, one, but also in the back of Sá's mind, these guys study the players that they're coming up against. He would have thought that Saka's going that way. Absolutely no chance of saving it. And what does bode well going forward, I've named Kai Havertz in a positive fashion. Bukayo Saka is another. David Raya is another. These are players that have altered the game state to our benefit at periods in the match where we weren't necessarily at our imperious best. That there is an element of cutting edge that we need. Well, one, we need to see it from other players, and I'll come on to that. But that is something that does bode well going forward, okay? But the other thing that struck me about this game, a lot's been said about Arteta's use of his squad, his use of substitutes, who he trusts. And I'm not really going to talk about transfers right now because I don't know about you. Not only do I not want to talk about transfers anymore, I can't really listen to much conversation about transfers anymore. It's been, I know that every transfer window is bad, but this transfer window for me, it really does feel like it's been done to death. So I'm not going to talk about it. All right. Now I'm going to park transfers for a minute. I'm going to revisit that. We'll do an in-depth transfer focus video for the One Mic podcast when the window closes. So around the Brighton game. But let's talk about the use of the squad. Notably from the outset, Kivior wasn't involved in the squad at all. Saka did come off eventually holding his knee, but Arteta says afterwards he's fine, and Rice also came off, but thankfully sounds like it was only cramp. But when Saka comes off, if you're Reece Nelson, you're viably perceived as one of the only backup options, notwithstanding the fact that people don't necessarily think you're up to scratch in that position, but you still don't come on the odd occasion that Saka comes off. And it's in fact Trossard who comes on and Martinelli that moves over. I mean, so if Reece was thinking that he was perhaps second in the pecking order in that position, sadly he's not now. He's not now. So what's Reece thinking in that situation? What's Kivior thinking when he's not involved in the matchday squad? Is he thinking, well, I'm not involved now. What happens when Tomiyasu comes back? Do I have a shout at being involved at all, right? And I'm dealing with all of this now because I want to talk about the idea of motivation. Arteta, if you watch the All or Nothing documentary, he was asked about his substitutes in that documentary, and he said, look, we are all sort of putting together one common goal, one common vision. Everyone knows. I think he was delving into Rob Holding's contribution because Rob Holding wasn't getting many minutes there. And it was absolutely everyone knows what their role is, and they feel just as much a part of striving for success as everyone else. I don't know if that's going to be true if a lot of these players stay. I really don't. I've spoken about Kivior. I've spoken about Reece. Eddie Nketiah agreed personal terms with another club. So he knows that also he's not indispensable. In fact, he's very much dispensable. It sounds like he's also on a list to get shifted. And he also knows that it's basically going to be Kai Havertz and Gabriel Jesus fighting out for that position. And there were moments last season where, in fact, Trossard was playing through the middle. Aaron Ramsdale is another. We've just spoken about how spectacular David Raya was. if Aaron Ramsdale has to come in for a game, I mean, it won't be a Brentford game now because we've got David Raya on a permanent, but if he comes in for a game, my point here is, are any of these players going to have the best motivation possible for a squad player? And by that, the best motivation is, if I get this right, I have a viable route into a starting position. I don't think any of them are. Because when you're talking about letting players go as a manager, you have somewhat shown your hand a little. So the Arsenal hierarchy and the behind-the-scenes team, they have a lot of work to do to ensure that these players don't fall into that trap. Because I want to use a real-life example. And this isn't bespoke to my career. Anyone can apply this to their own jobs, right? Let's say there's the gig at work that you really want. You absolutely want it. Someone is away on leave. You get the gig, and you absolutely think you've done what you need to do to deserve a place for the next gig, right? So you deserve your shot, but that person comes back and they get the gig back straight away. What are you going to be thinking? Are you going to be thinking that there's a viable route to career progression, or are you going to be somewhat demoralized, somewhat demotivated, sitting there thinking, well, it's obvious that I'm not rated at this place. I'm just not going to try as hard now. And the issue with that is, we need our squad this year. Best believe we need our squad this year. With this new Champions League format, with the idea that we need to push in other cup competitions because we can't turn up empty-handed this year, we absolutely need our squad. So that's all to say that I know that we have players that we trust. I know Arteta has players that he trusts. But if we are going to retain these players, once the window closes, we need to rectify that. We absolutely need to rectify that. That was our first home game. Pyrotechnics at the beginning. Everyone was up for it. Our opponents next week, Aston Villa, that's their first home game. They were away at West Ham to begin the season. Late kickoff on a Saturday gives their fans a lot of time to get in the mood for that game. That is going to be a hostile atmosphere. And I stuck around at the studio yesterday after the watch along to watch Aston Villa against West Ham. Sorry, West Ham versus Aston Villa. My main takeaways from that were Aston Villa actually looked even more direct than they did last year. They had, Amadou Onana. I mean, I don't want to be that guy, but was he not someone that we could have looked at? And I'm not just saying that because of the goal, but he really put himself about and made a tangible difference in that midfield. Yesterday, I'm not going to say they didn't look like they missed Douglas Luiz, and I understand they're not exactly the same player, but he definitely raised the level. But the dynamism of Leon Bailey, they had Rodgers, they had the luxury of being able to take Watkins off on the hour mark and bring on someone like Duran, their second choice striker, who has a one-on-one in behind, strikes it cleanly but misses, doesn't make the same mistake again. Next time he gets his chance, he scores. He's the match winner. He's the difference maker. They are so direct that this could be a tough day at the office next weekend. And you will no doubt remember that after we beat Leverkusen, Alonso was asked about Arteta and his mindset and his mentality. And he said that Arteta is, I think it was a competitive animal or a competitive monster or something like that, right? So if you're by nature a competitive animal and a competitive monster, put yourself in Arteta's shoes for a minute. He's taken this job on at Arsenal. His predecessor was Unai Emery. Unai Emery has gone to a club that, for all intents and purposes, has a slightly lesser expectation in terms of what they ought to be achieving. Did the double over us last year. I think that's been eating Arteta up. And I think that's going to have been eating the players up. And I say that because if you haven't watched this already, it's quite telling into the mindset of real elite sportsmen. Erling Haaland, after the Chelsea game, was asked about the goal that he scores. And he says, there was a save last year where Sanchez hung back on the line. And it's been eating me up since then. I've been thinking about it a lot. So in this situation, I knew that I had to take the extra touch, hold on to it and dink it and get it over. He's sitting there worrying about one missed chance, notwithstanding the fact that he won the Golden Boot and they won the league. That's elite mindset. And I do think that Arteta and this Arsenal team have that mindset. But for me, this Saturday, this is about revenge. Yeah? In the words of Tupac, revenge is like the sweetest joy. And I'm not going to finish it because it's not family friendly, but if you know, you know. I think that there might need to be some lineup changes here. because of how direct Villa are. Let's talk about Zinchenko. I thought Zinchenko had a very good game against Aston Villa, against Wolves, don't get me wrong. But Villa pose a slightly different threat going forward. Certainly if you look at their form last season, their personnel, and what they did to West Ham. And this isn't that. The wonderful thing is this now isn't a situation where I'm saying drop Zinchenko. I'm just saying maybe you hold him back for a game like this and use him in a game that's more appropriate for someone like Zinchenko. And I don't actually even need to mention Calafiori right now, because I think it would be daft to give him the baptism of fire of Aston Villa away, 5:30 or whatever it is on a Saturday. Timber came on yesterday and obviously looked defensively solid, an absolute touch of class with most of his touches, and carried a lot of threat going forward. I mean, bizarrely, he was popping up on the right-hand side a fair bit, but I just think he's a more apt fit for this game. Let me know in the comments if you agree, because I completely understand that sometimes when you come up against a team like Aston Villa, attack can be the best form of defence. But I actually worry that going for machine with a team like Villa, trying to fight fire with fire, could end up in a game where you completely lack control. And if there's one thing we know about this Arsenal side and Arteta is not only do we not like not having control, but we don't necessarily fare well when we don't have control. So that's why I'd perhaps make that change. Let's talk about Thomas Partey as well. I want to preface all of this by saying anything that I say about Thomas Partey right now, before all my Ghanaian brothers and sisters try and hit me up in the comments, I'm only saying this because I rate Thomas Partey so highly, and I know that when he is at the pinnacle of his powers, he is one of the best at it in the world, okay? Thomas Partey, for me, I'm going to park the back end of last season. I'm not going to talk about pre-season. I'm just going to go on the last game. He seems to have lost a bit of that burst. And I think he does need a bit of time to be in an environment that Villa Park is no doubt going to be like. And with Thomas Partey in the team, although he is the guy that has that sort of progressive passing that can change the game, I feel as though he's not necessarily the midfielder that you want when you want to take the sting out of a game. And when I'm looking at the Wolves game, although the back four had their own deficiencies, I think a lot of the opportunities that Wolves managed to manufacture were in actual fact because they managed to get through our midfield quite easily. And it gave the back four a fair bit too much to do. Or someone like Partey gave the ball away in front of the back four. And I understand that obviously if you're taking risks and you're not playing the obvious pass and you're playing the risky pass, sometimes you will give the ball away. But certain turnovers yesterday, I think, were in situations that when Thomas Partey is at his best, he doesn't do it. Put it that way. And if you do want to take the sting out of it, is this a game for Jorginho? Is this a game for Jorginho, someone who can control the tempo a bit better, neutralise the game, let us get a foothold at Villa Park in a hostile environment? I'm going to give my answer now. I think I do change the lineup for the Villa game. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm being far too sort of risk averse here, but I think I want to go with Timber instead of Zinchenko, and I do think I want to go with Jorginho instead of Partey. And if it comes to it, and that is too defensive, but it is still 0-0, we do have those options on the bench in addition to Jesus, Trossard, whoever. But everything else, I would keep the same. I spoke about Partey's turnovers, and this is one eye on Wolves, but also one eye on Villa. Saliba and Gabriel were uncharacteristic. I mean, that pass from Saliba, I don't think he necessarily wanted it from Raya in that position, but the reality of the situation is that when you play football the way that Arsenal play football, you will get the ball in spaces where you don't want it. You can't do what Saliba did, which I think was give it straight to Cunha. We were very, very lucky they didn't score there. Very, very lucky, and I think it was still 1-0 there. Gabriel was also a bit wasteful in possession. But this isn't unique to Arsenal players, by the way. Anyone that watched Manchester City versus Chelsea, Edison spilled a couple and was lucky that one of them was offside. Otherwise, it would have resulted in a goal. So, and you're talking about one of the best goalkeepers in the world. So nobody's immune. Being rusty is fine. I get it. It's the start of the season. But the problem with our fixture list is there is no room for rust at this stage because we're now going away to Villa Park. And they're a team that beat us twice last year. We've got Brighton. Now, I know a lot of people looked at Brighton at the Emirates as one of those games that, we should win. Dare I say it? Brighton looked quite good yesterday. I know that their opponents, I don't want to get the Merseyside massive onto me, so I'm not going to say too much about Everton, but dare I say it, Brighton looked really, really potent. And dare I say it, someone like Adingra Just saying. A lot of people turn their noses up at Adingra, but if you have 48 hours left in a transfer window, for example, and you want a bit of cover on that right-hand side, not a bad option. Not a bad option at all. But all in all, I'm going into this Aston Villa game, and if I'm looking at this cumulatively, the fact that we've just come off a win and a clean sheet, but also we've shown signs of what we absolutely cannot afford to do against Aston Villa, I think you can look at that as a spar. If you're a boxing fan, you'll know what I mean. Sometimes you get clamped in the jaw in a spar, you remember what it feels like, but you know exactly what that shot was that hit you, and you make sure it doesn't happen when you get to the main event. That's very much what I think this is going to be like. And I'm not just saying this hope, but I do think that we're going to address a lot of that wastefulness in possession, because although Arteta seemed quite calm about it and understanding about it in public, one thing the All or Nothing documentary has shown us is he can be one way in public and he can be scary in private when he has to be. I don't think he's going to be very forgiving with that lot at all for the individual errors that they made. That, taken with the competitive edge and the fact that this Arsenal team historically have been very, very good at righting wrongs, I do think that we're going to win. I do think that we're going to win at Villa Park. And if I have to give you a prediction, I'm leaning towards 1-0 to the Arsenal. This is the problem when you do things on the internet. This could come back to bite me, couldn't it? I'm leaning towards 1-0 to the Arsenal. I think it's going to be a game where we try to take the sting out of it. If we don't try and take the sting out of it and it turns into an end-to-end fighting fire with fire game, this could be a 4-2. It could go completely the other way, but I don't think that's the approach that we're going to take. I think we're looking at 1-0 to the Arsenal. Okay. Now, last week, I introduced a segment called Wrong Answers Only. I'm going to bring it back this week because, as I said, I love engaging with the comments, and some of you are absolutely hilarious. I laugh out loud levels. For me, there was a clear winner this week, but I did say I'm going to read out some of my favorite ones. I've got them written down here. Apologies if I missed any. There were so many, I can't read them all out. But the question was, what is Erik ten Hag's favorite song? Braxton May comes out with I Whip My Hair Back and Forth by Willow Smith. And I couldn't help but think about Erik ten Hag and his bald head trying to whip his hair back and forth, because we all know that guy. You know what? Erik ten Hag feels himself, you know. Have you seen him in presses and on the touch? That guy is feeling himself. And on that note, we had Unseated Mars, who came out with I'm Too Sexy by Right Said Fred, and Sanjay Jarath coming out with Mr. Loverman by Shabba. Also very, very good shouts. But the winner for me, I don't know if I condone the username, Fantastic Deviant, but the winner for me, he said Smack That by Akon. Now, when I read that, I sat there and I thought, well, Mr. Fantastic Deviant, where are you going with that? But it is genius. We all know that there are rumors that Ruud van Nistelrooy is sort of lurking in the shadows, ready to take over from Erik ten Hag. I had to sing it to understand what Fantastic Deviant was saying. You all know how Smack That goes, yeah? He's remixed the lyrics, which is why he's won this week. And his remix is, I feel rude creeping, I can see it from my shadow. I mean, come on. You have the winner there. And that rounds off last week's Wrong Answers Only. So for this week, and I used the fact that Chelsea just lost to Manchester City and we saw their owner get up before the full-time whistle and walk off in a bit of a huff. This week's question: what is the first thing that Todd Bowley does when he wakes up? Wrong Answers Only. You all know how to play. This has been the One Mic Podcast, episode 2. We will be back next week after the Aston Villa game, hopefully with another win for the Arsenal. Until next time.